After Mary described why she tied a gilt coachman, she doesn't say anything more about any of the other coachman flies. They are just illustrated and named. This is the orange coachman, and maybe it's a predecessor of the royal coachman. I am tying it on a number 8 hook. I'm using claret thread because of the color of the head on the fly. I am going to tie in a little piece of bicolor tinsel, tie it in with the gold towards the hook, bring my thread out of the way, and then as I wrap it, the gold will show. I am tying this fly off of the illustration in Mary Orvis Marbury's book, Favorite Flies and Their Histories, which was published in 1892. So a gold tag may be a little bit bigger than the one in the illustration, but I can cover the front of that tag with the butt. I can bring my thread back to the tie-in point, catch in that tinsel, clip out the extra. I'm going to take my thread up to the front of the hook where I'm going to tie in just one strand of Peacock herl. And part of the reason for this is to build the body a little bit. Bring it back to where I want the butt on this coachman. I'll bring my thread up out of the way and then just take a few wraps back here. She has a pretty healthy herl butt on her fly. I'm going to say that's good. Bring my thread back to catch that off. And then I am going to again wrap forward on that herl. Snap it out. I'm using some burnt orange 300 denier floss. It's actually 4 strands of floss. And I'm going to tie that in up here at the front of the hook. And then wrap back on it to the butt. And bring my thread back up to the front. And then wrap, even touching wraps to create that orange body. I guess that's why it's called the orange coachman. And I want to be conscious to leave plenty of room behind the eye of the hook for the hackle and wing, and I guess I can call it a thorax. Tie that off, clip it out, and then I'm going to tie in another section or herl of Peacock, and I'm tying it in by the butt end. I've trimmed off the far butt end, and then I'll just wrap. Gotta try to match that back butt with, I guess I'm going to call this the thorax. So you have a peacock herl butt and a peacock herl thorax with that orange body between. And then wraps over the top to catch it in. Wraps underneath to secure it. Oh, didn't snap at the right place, so let's clip it. For the hackle on this fly, I am using some yellow. I'm pretty sure that would be dyed. And I think this is rooster neck. It's not as tight as a dry fly hackle would be, but the rooster has a straighter barbs on it. So I'm going to grab the tip of that feather with my hackle pliers, pull back on all the barbs. That will become the hackle. I didn't get that very evenly divided there. Okay. And I'll just clip that tip to create just a little triangle. Lay that triangle against the shank of the hook up behind the eye and wrap up over it. Catch it in. And I'll reattach my hackle plier to the butt end of that feather, pull back on the fibers. So this is the way I would normally wrap a soft hackle wet fly. For a soft hackle, though, I'm going to be using hen feathers or some other bird like a partridge. For this fly, I am using this rooster so that I do have the longer fibers, so they are a little bit stiffer, but I am tying them in the way I would tie in a soft hackle. Because this fly was probably fished wet, I did read an article recently talking about flies of that era, 1800s, middle to late 1800s, that because of the materials that were used, even though they might have had the intent of a fly that would float, they got waterlogged very quickly and ended up being fished more as we would fish a wet fly today. So just 3 wraps over the top of that butt end stem, and then I'll just wrap up over the end of that. Start building a head. Don't want too much yet. And then find that stem in here so I can see if I can just break it out of there. Yep. I like to break it out rather than cut it because it generally breaks closer to the hook shank. For the wings, I'm using a goose shoulder, and this looks like it's probably a center feather. It's pretty even on both sides, so I'm just cutting a section from each side of this. And generally the rule of thumb is to cut the width of the hook gape, but I find this feather to compress a lot when I tie it in, so I'm actually grabbing a piece that's quite a bit wider than the hook gape. So I have 2 sections. I lay them together, measure the length of the wing, get it kind of down in between the hackle fibers on top of the hook, and then I'm going to pinch that together, and I'm going to bring my thread up and do a pinch wrap and then pull down on those and wrap around them to wrap them in place. I'll wrap backwards up a little bit, creating that head, and then I can come back in and trim off the ends, the waist, the extra, the butts. And then clean that up by just wrapping over it. It looks like I've caught some hackle in there. I'm going to trim that out. Now let me do a whip finish first, and that way I won't cut my thread when I trim out the hackle. When Mary tied flies, there were no eyes on the hooks, and they used what was called gut. It's actually the innards of the silkworm, the pouches in which the silk would have come from, but the silkworms are harvested prior to that happening, and that is tied on to the shank of the hook, either making a little loop right there or a longer leader. So I'm going to go ahead and trim out these hackle fibers that I caught up here in the head. And I do use a diluted goop for my head cement. I'll leave a recipe for the goop in the description. Stick a needle in my jar, grab a drop, put that on the head, and that'll just soak into the head, and that'll dry clear. This is a orange Coachman from Mary Orvis Marbury's book, Favorite Flies and Their Histories.